Somewhere above a river, on the flat, dark crown of a hill, a single oil lamp is burning. It is a small thing, clay, no larger than your hand, a spout, a wick, a spoonful of olive oil. Its flame is about the size of a leaf, and it trembles a little whenever the night air moves, and yet a light like this one, repeated in window after window down a hillside, was all the light a Roman knight had. The hill is the Palatine. The river is the Tiber, and the city taking shape in the darkness around that flame is Rome, last time the Nile. Tonight, the Tiber. Hello, and welcome back to Drift with History. As always, there is nothing you need to do tonight. There will be no quiz at the end. If you drift off somewhere between the kings and the emperors, good. That is exactly what this is for. The story will carry on without you, quite happily, the way Rome itself carried on for more than 1,000 years. So get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day go. Tonight, we are following one city from a cluster of shepherds' fires on a muddy hilltop, through a kingdom, a republic, and an empire that reached from the rains of northern Britain to the cataracts of the Nile, and then onward, gently, into the long dusk where its lamps burned lower, and its light became something else. 12 centuries, and wherever the old sources allow it, we will travel the way this channel likes to travel. At night, we will stand with sentries on the walls of a legion camp, listening for the password to come around. We will walk behind the night watchmen with their lanterns and their buckets. We will hear the carts that were only allowed into the city after dark, grinding over the paving stones while the city tried to sleep. We'll move slowly. We have all night. This is the story of ancient Rome. Every city has a story about where it came from. Rome's begins, fittingly, at night. Picture the hills above the Tiber, nearly 3,000 years ago. No temples, no marble, just 7 low hilltops above a marshy river valley. And on their slopes, the small red fires of shepherds, each one guarding a few huts of thatch and mud. Here is the story the Romans themselves told. And let's be clear from the start. It is a legend, and the Romans half knew it. They said their line began with Aeneas, a prince who escaped the burning of Troy and wandered west to Italy. Generations later, in the hill town of Alba Longa, a princess named Rhea Silvia, a priestess sworn never to marry, bore 10 sons and named the god of war himself, Mars, as their father. The king, fearing the boys, ordered them drowned in the Tiber, but the river, the story says, was gentle with them. The basket washed ashore beneath a fig tree at the foot of the Palatine hill, where a she-wolf found the twins and, instead of harming them, nursed them in a cave the Romans would later call the Lupercal. A shepherd named Faustulus carried them home, and the boys, Romulus and Remus, grew up herding sheep on the very hills you're imagining now. You may know how it ends. The brothers quarreled over which hill the new city should stand on, over an omen of birds, over a wall, and Romulus killed Remus and gave the city his own name. By Roman tradition, that founding day was the 21st of April. In the year 753 BC. That date, by the way, is a convention worked out by Roman scholars centuries after the fact, and even the ancient writers couldn't quite agree among themselves on the year. So hold it lightly. It's not a date anyone wrote down at the time. It's a date Rome chose to remember. And what does the ground itself say? Archaeologists have found traces of people living on the Palatine and the hills around it from at least the 9th century BC. Stone foundations and potsherds older than the legend's own founding day. The real Rome was not founded in a single afternoon by a single man. It grew slowly, as villages of thatched huts on neighboring hilltops traded and married, and gradually became one town. One archaeologist has pointed to the remains of an 8th century wall on the Palatine slope and argued that perhaps some kernel of the founding story is real. But most scholars remain gently unconvinced. The honest answer is that Rome begins in mud and firelight, and nobody was taking notes. The valley between those hills, the ground that would one day be the Forum, the most famous public square on earth, was a floodplain. Soggy, reedy, prone to standing water. Before Rome could have a heart, someone had to drain it. And tradition credits the city's later kings with cutting the Great Drain, the Cloaca Maxima, that carried the marsh away into the Tiber. Those kings deserve a quiet word. Roman tradition counted 7 of them, from Romulus down to a proud, unloved man named Tarquin. Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Arrogant. The later kings have an Etruscan flavor, drawn from the sophisticated civilization to Rome's north, and historians treat them as half-remembered rather than documented. That Rome was once ruled by kings, and that the Etruscans deeply shaped it. That much is accepted. The tidy list of 7 names, reigning neatly for 244 years, that is memory smoothed into story. But before we leave the legend behind, one detail worth keeping. That cave, the Lupercal, where the wolf was said to have nursed the twins, was a real place, a real shrine at the foot of the Palatine, tended for century after century, deep into the age of the emperors. Every year, on the 15th of February, in broad daylight, the festival of the Lupercalia began there, priests gathering at the cave, and young men running the old boundary of the Palatine, in a rite so ancient the Romans themselves weren't sure what it meant. Think about that for a moment. Romans of the Marble Age could walk down from their palaces and visit the physical site of their own myth. The city kept a door open to its beginning, and by tradition, in the year 509 BC, the age of kings came to an end. The story of how the kings fell is another one the Romans told with more passion than paperwork. Tradition says the son of King Tarquin committed a terrible outrage against a noblewoman named Lucretia, and that her death lit a fire in the city. Led by a man named Brutus. Remember that family name, it will return. The Romans rose, shut the gates against their king, and swore an oath that would echo for the next 500 years. Never again would one man rule Rome. Hold on to that oath. It sounds like a beginning, and it is. But it is also, quietly, a loaded spring. Centuries from now, on a March afternoon, that same old fear of kings will gather around a man named Caesar. Rome never forgot this promise. That is rather the problem. In place of a king, the Romans built something deliberately awkward. 2 consuls, elected for a single year. 2, so that each could check the other. 1 year, so that neither could settle in. Around them, the Senate, a council of elders offering advice that was difficult to refuse, and beneath it all, assemblies of ordinary citizens, voting. Power was split, on purpose, like a flame divided among many lamps, so that no single hand could ever carry all the light. The young republic told hero stories about itself, and the loveliest thing about them is that Rome's own historians didn't quite believe them. Take Horatius. When an Etruscan army marched on the city, the story goes, one soldier, Horatius Cocles, stood alone on the wooden bridge over the Tiber, holding back the enemy while his comrades hacked the bridge down behind him, then leapt into the river in full armor and swam home. Livy, the great Roman historian who preserved the tale, added his own gentle wink. He called it, and this is his phrase, an act of daring more famous than credible with posterity. Rome's own chronicler, telling you softly that the story had grown in the telling, We can tell these stories honestly because the Romans hedged them first. Or take Cincinnatus. In an hour of military crisis, tradition places it in 458 BC. The Senate's messengers crossed the Tiber to fetch him and found the old statesman at dawn, ploughing his own small field. They gave him absolute power, the emergency office of dictator, meant to last only until the danger passed. He beat the enemy, laid the power down, and was back at his plough within days. The portrait is idealized, certainly, but the office was real, and so was the ideal. Rome wanted to believe that power was something you picked up like a tool and put down again. Not everything in these years was legend. Around 450 BC, the Romans did something quietly revolutionary. They wrote the law down. The 12 Tables, the city's first written code, were posted in the forum for anyone to read. Until then, the law had lived in the memories of the patricians, the old aristocratic families, to be recited as it suited them. Now it stood in public, in the open air. Only fragments survive, quoted by later writers. But the idea survived entirely, and that idea was one small victory in a much longer, slower contest. The struggle between the patricians and the plebeians. The broad mass of ordinary Romans over debt, land, and who was allowed to hold office. It ran on and off for some 200 years, and Rome resolved it not with a revolution, but with a long bargain. The plebeians won their own officers, the tribunes whose persons were sacred, whose word could halt the state. In time, the vote of the plebeians gained the force of law for everyone. In time, a plebeian could be consul. Rome argued its way, decade by decade, toward itself, and through all of it, this was still a small farming city. The political day began at first light, out of doors, and when the sun went down, early Rome simply stopped. Fields dark, lanes quiet, a few embers banked on a few hearths, and the long country silence. Keep that silence somewhere in your mind tonight, because centuries from now, when this little town has swollen into a city of 1 million people, its nights will be anything but quiet, and we will be there to listen. For 100 years the young republic grew and fought its neighbors and grew again. And then, one summer day, it very nearly died. By Roman tradition, the year was 390 BC. Greek historians suggest it was really 3 or 4 years later, when a war band of Gauls came down from the north under a chieftain named Brennus. At a little river called the Alaia, a few miles from the city, the Roman army broke and ran. The date, the 18th of July, was marked in the calendar as an unlucky day forever after. The Romans did not pretend it hadn't happened. They wrote it into the year itself. The Gauls walked into Rome almost unopposed and sacked it. What remained of the defenders withdrew onto the steepest of the 7 hills, the Palatine, the citadel, the hill of the temples, and there they held out, week after hungry week, while the Gauls camped in the ruined streets below. And from that siege comes one of the great night scenes in all of Roman memory. Here is the story the Romans told about that night, and as with so much in these early centuries, the telling gathered polish over the years. So take it as the city's cherished memory of itself. One moonless night, the story goes, the Gauls found a path up the Palatine cliff and began to climb, hand over hand, in silence, so quietly that not even the dogs stirred. But in the temple precinct at the top lived the sacred geese of Juno, birds the starving defenders had refused to eat, even at their hungriest, because they belonged to the goddess, and geese are light sleepers. As the first Gaul's hand found the cliff top, the flock erupted, honking, beating their wings in the dark. A soldier named Marcus Manlius reached the edge first and threw the lead climber back down onto the men behind him. The citadel held because somebody fed the geese. The Romans loved that story precisely because the heroes were absurd, not a demigod, not a genius general. Geese. The later embellishments, Brennus tossing his sword onto the scales and sneering, "Woe to the vanquished." The exiled hero Camillus arriving at the last possible moment to save the day. Those scholars treat as patriotic embroidery, added by storytellers who couldn't bear the plain truth. And the plain truth is short. The Gauls beat a Roman army and took Rome. It would be very nearly 800 years before any foreign enemy managed it again. Remember the geese, and remember that number. At the far end of tonight's story, on another dark night, we will come back to it. Rome rebuilt, hastily, crookedly. People joked ever after about its tangled streets. And then, across the next century, this once burned city did something remarkable. It absorbed Italy. Slow wars in the mountains against the tough Samnite peoples, and then a collision with the wider Greek world, when King Pyrrhus of Epirus crossed the sea with a professional army and war elephants, and beat the Romans twice, losing so many of his own veterans each time that he is said to have remarked that one more such victory would ruin him. He sailed home, and his name became a phrase we still use Pyrrhic victory. A win that costs you the war, because here was Rome's peculiar genius. And it's worth saying slowly, since it explains almost everything that follows. Rome did not simply defeat its neighbors, it absorbed them. Roads were laid to their towns. Colonies of Roman settlers were planted among them. Former enemies became allies, and allies, in time, supplied soldiers. So each defeated rival made Rome not weaker, but deeper. A well of manpower no single battle could empty. Other ancient states could lose one great battle and collapse. Rome could lose, and simply keep coming. In the next chapter, a man from Carthage is going to test exactly that, more terribly than anyone ever would again. Across the water from Italy, near enough to be a rival, far enough to be a rumor, lay the other great power of the Western Sea, Carthage, a city of merchants and sailors on the North African coast, older than Rome, richer than Rome, and for a long while, politely indifferent to Rome. Two powers, one sea. Between 264 and 146 BC, they fought 3 wars. Together, those wars are the hinge on which the whole ancient world turned. The first war was fought largely on water, over the island of Sicily, which was awkward because the Romans barely had a navy. So they built one, and when it sank, they built another. Polybius tells the story that a Carthaginian warship ran aground early in the war, and the Romans hauled it up and copied it, plank by plank, while farm boys learned to row on benches set out on dry land. Historians think he overstated Rome's innocence of the sea. There were Greek allies in southern Italy who had sailed for centuries. But it is the story Rome liked to tell about itself. It took 23 years, and Rome lost more crews to storms than to the enemy. Whole fleets swallowed by weather. But Carthage tired first. That was the lesson the ancient world was slow to learn about Rome. It did not have to be better. It simply refused to stop. The Second War has a name attached to it that people still know. 22 centuries later, Hannibal. In 218 BC, rather than wait for Rome to come to him, the Carthaginian general marched an army out of Spain, through southern Gaul, and over the Alps, in autumn, with war elephants. It is one of the most famous images in ancient history, and it deserves a moment of quiet awe rather than spectacle. Because the crossing was a catastrophe survived, not a parade. Snow, landslides, hostile tribes, animals and men lost in the passes. What came down into Italy was a fraction of what had set out, and it proceeded to terrify Rome for 15 years. Twice Hannibal destroyed Roman armies sent against him. And then, on the 2nd of August, 216 BC, near a village called Cannae, he did something generals have studied ever since. Facing the largest army Rome had ever fielded, he let his own center bend backwards, drawing the Romans in, while his cavalry and his African veterans closed around their flanks like two hands cupping. By evening, the greatest army of the Republic had ceased to exist. How many died at Cannae? Even the ancients could not agree. Livy counted some 48,000 dead. Polybius said 70,000. Modern historians tend to think the true figure sat nearer 30,000, and some would go lower still. We will never know. What every source agrees on is that there had never been a darker day in Roman history, and the city expected Hannibal at the gates. He never came. And Rome, this is the astonishing part, did not negotiate. Livy, our only source for the scene, writing generations later in a patriotic mood, says the citizens went out along the road to meet the surviving consul, every order of them, high and low, and thanked him for not despairing of the Republic. Not a vote in the Senate, a crowd on a road. And then the city raised new legions. That deep well of allied manpower, dug over a century of roads and colonies, now held. The general Fabius shadowed Hannibal for years, refusing pitched battle, letting the seasons do the fighting, patience raised to a strategy. And since we are a nighttime channel, let's leave the battlefield and visit those legions where our kind of story lives, in camp after sundown. We know exactly how a Roman camp passed the night, because Polybius, a Greek who marched with Roman armies, wrote the procedure down. Each evening, as the light failed, a soldier from the 10th maniple of each class went to the tribune's tent and received the tessera, a small wooden tablet with the night's watchword written on it. It passed from maniple to maniple, hand to hand in front of witnesses, all the way along the lines and back to the tribunes, so that if the word failed to come home, they knew precisely where it had stopped. Through the 4 watches of the night, mounted inspectors walked the rounds, checking sentry after sentry in the dark. And a sentry found asleep faced the harshest law in the army, a court at dawn, and death at the hands of his own comrades, the men whose lives his closed eyes had gambled. It is a hard rule, and we can regard it from a reflective distance, while understanding what it bought. Polybius put it simply: the night watches of the Roman army are most scrupulously kept. That discipline, that patience, that refusal to stop slowly turned the war. A young Roman general, Scipio, carried the fight to Spain and then to Africa itself, forcing Hannibal home to defend Carthage. At Zama, in 202 BC, the two finest commanders of the age finally met, and Hannibal, for the first time in his life, lost a set battle. It was also the last time. The war was over. Carthage survived, diminished for another half-century, while in Rome, the old senator Cato ended speech after speech on any subject at all with the phrase history remembers as Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome finally manufactured its excuse. The Third War was less a war than a 3-year siege, and in 146 BC, Carthage was taken and leveled and its people enslaved. You may have heard that the Romans plowed salt into the ruins so nothing would grow there. That detail is a later invention. No ancient source records it. The truth needed no garnish. That same year, on the other side of the sea, Rome also sacked the Greek city of Corinth from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. There was no rival left. In a single year, Rome had erased the two cities that might have argued. Rome had won the world. What it could not yet see was what the world would do to Rome. Here is a strange truth about victory. It has a price, and the bill arrives late. The wealth of the conquered Mediterranean poured into Italy, and with it, enslaved people. In numbers, the old farming Sassani had never imagined. Rich Romans bought up the countryside and worked vast estates with slave labor. And the small farmers, the very men who had filled the legions that won the wars, came home from their campaigns to find they could not compete. Plot by plot, they sold up and drifted into the city, poor, landless, and increasingly angry. The Republic's soldiers had conquered the world and lost their farms doing it. That paradox, slow and structural, is the deep current under everything in this chapter. The names that follow are just the places where it broke the surface. The first name is Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the people, elected in 133 BC. He proposed taking public land back from the wealthy occupiers and settling the landless poor on it. The Senate's hardliners saw a demagogue reaching for power, and at the height of the crisis, a crowd of senators and their men attacked him at a public meeting, and Tiberius and hundreds of his followers were beaten to death. It was the first open political bloodshed Rome had seen in centuries. We can keep a reflective distance from the violence and still hear what it meant. argument that Romans had always, somehow, settled with words, had been settled with clubs. A line was crossed that never quite uncrossed. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius took up the same cause, further and faster. And in 121 BC, he too died in a day of political violence. The brothers Gracchi had asked the Republic a question about land and hunger, and the Republic had answered with blood. Then came a quieter change, easy to miss and more fatal than any riot. The general Marius, needing soldiers, opened the legions to men who owned nothing. The army of small farmers became an army of long-serving professionals, men whose farm, pension, and future depended not on the Republic, but on their general. From now on, every ambitious commander held something no consul's speech could match, an army that was personally his. Nothing happened immediately. It just became possible, and then it happened. In 88 BC, the general Sulla, feuding with Marius over a command, did the unthinkable. He marched his own legions on Rome. The city had no walls against its own army. No Roman soldier had ever been asked to draw a sword on the city itself. Sulla took Rome, twice in the end. After the second time, he had lists posted in the forum, the prescriptions, columns of names, each one a Roman citizen whom anyone might now kill for a reward. Then, having rewritten the constitution in his own favor, this man who had shown every future warlord the road into Rome voluntarily gave up power and retired. Even the Romans found him hard to explain. The same decades carried another convulsion. In 73 BC, about 70 gladiators broke out of a training school at Capua, armed at first with knives from the kitchens. Their leader's name was Spartacus. Within 2 years, the escape had grown into an army of tens of thousands of enslaved and dispossessed people, and it defeated Roman forces again and again before it was finally crushed by the general Crassus. We'll pass over the cruelties on both sides at a distance and simply note what the rising revealed. How much of Italy's wealth now rested on people with every reason to burn it down. Crassus himself is worth one more moment, because he tells you what Rome had become. Reputedly, the richest man in the city, he had built part of that fortune on fire. When a building caught alight, and in Rome's cramped, timber-built streets, they always did, Crassus's agents would appear at the scene and offer to buy the burning property and its threatened neighbors on the spot at a desperate discount. His private brigade of enslaved firefighters stood ready, and the pump started when the sale closed. Rome, remember, had no public fire service at all. Keep that in mind. In a few chapters, someone is finally going to fix it, and we will walk the night streets with the men who did. By 63 BC, the Republic's crises were arriving almost annually. That year, the consul Cicero uncovered a conspiracy by a ruined aristocrat named Palatine to seize the state by force. Picture the scene the sources give us. The Senate summoned in emergency, guards on the temples, the great orator rising by lamplight to accuse a traitor sitting only benches away. The plot was broken. The Republic was saved. Again. But each rescue was leaving it a little more exhausted, a little more used to soldiers in its politics, a little more ready for a strong man's shadow. The shadow, when it came, had a name, and the name was Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar spent the years from 58 to 50 BC conquering Gaul, modern France and beyond, in 8 relentless campaigns that he narrated himself. In dispatches Rome read like serialized adventure. The climax came at Alesia in 52 BC, where the great Gallic war leader Vercingetorix gathered a final revolt, and Caesar, besieging the hilltop town, while a relief army besieged him, built 2 rings of fortifications, one facing in, one facing out, and starved the revolt into surrender. Gaul was Roman, and Caesar now possessed exactly what Marius had made possible, and Sulla had made thinkable: limitless glory, and an army that was his. His enemies in the Senate saw it clearly. As his command expired, they ordered him to lay down his legions and come home as a private citizen, home to courts and prosecutions prepared by men who feared him. And so we arrive at one of the true night scenes of history. Not a legend this time, but a documented, sleepless night, the 10th of January, 49 BC. A damp winter darkness in northern Italy. At the edge of Caesar's province runs a little stream called the Rubicon, small enough to step across, and yet the most important line in the Roman world, because to bring soldiers south of it was, in law, to invade your own country. Somewhere in that darkness, Caesar halted. Suetonius pictures him hesitating at the bank, turning over the enormity of what one step would set in motion. Plutarch shows him anguished, silent, weighing it until the last possible moment. Both were writing generations later, but both understood what mattered: that everything Rome would become balanced that night on the width of a stream he crossed. Tradition says he spoke as he did it. The die is cast, though our sources can't agree whether he said it in Latin or in Greek, or whether he was quoting an old comic playwright. whether he said anything at all. The hedge doesn't weaken the scene. A man gambling a 500-year republic might well reach for someone else's words. The civil war that followed ran across the whole Mediterranean, and Caesar won it, decisively at Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BC. The chase after his rival Pompey carried him to Egypt, where in Alexandria he met the young Queen Cleopatra and took her cause and her company. If you were with us last time, you know her story is winding toward Rome. Hold that thread. The next chapter is hers. By early 44 BC, Caesar was back in Rome, loaded with honors no Roman had ever held, including the one that mattered: dictator. Not for 6 months, as the old emergency law allowed. For life. Amid the politics, one of his reforms deserves a gentle pause, because it is physically present in your room tonight. The Roman calendar had drifted hopelessly out of step with the sun. Caesar fixed it. A year of 365 days, with a leap day every 4th year, beginning in 45 BC. Lightly corrected 16 centuries later, that is the calendar on your wall, still keeping Caesar's time. He also, in his tidying of the city's laws, banned carts and wagons from Rome's streets during the day. A traffic regulation. It sounds like nothing. Remember it, because that little rule is going to fill Rome's nights with noise for centuries, and we will lie awake in them soon. But Rome had not forgotten its oldest oath: dictator for life. To Roman ears, that was a king by another name. And the old fear from the first days of the Republic came awake. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, the Ides of March, the Senate met in a hall attached to Pompey's theatre. The conspirators called themselves liberators. Among them was Marcus Brutus, carrying the very family name under which the kings had been driven out. They crowded around Caesar's chair and killed him there. At the foot of Pompey's statue, Plutarch says, "Et tu, Brute." You too, Brutus, belongs to Shakespeare, 16 centuries later, not to the historians. Suetonius records only, and only as a rumour others told, that Caesar said a few words in Greek to Brutus: "Kai su, teknon." You too, child. And he adds that by other accounts, Caesar said nothing at all, simply drew his toga over his face and let it happen in silence. The liberators believed they had saved the Republic. They had, in fact, buried it. What rose from the funeral takes our story back to Egypt. If you drifted with us down the Nile last time, you'll remember where that story ended. with a queen, Cleopatra the Seventh, last of the Ptolemies, playing the weakest hand in the Mediterranean with astonishing skill. Tonight, her story and Rome's finally become the same story. Caesar's death left two heirs to his power: Octavian, his adopted son, barely 19, cold, careful, and endlessly underestimated, and Mark Antony, Caesar's greatest lieutenant, charming, experienced, beloved by the legions. For a while they divided the world between them, and Antony took the east, where he ruled beside and then loved Cleopatra. Two Romans, one world. The arithmetic never worked. The war, when it came, was fought with fleets and with stories. And one gentle caution before we watch the ending: nearly everything we know of it was written on the winner's side by moralizing authors a generation or more later. Their Antony is a great man dissolved by passion. Their Octavian marches to a destined victory. History, here, was written by lamplight in the victors' houses, and it shows the 2nd of September, 31 BC, off Actium, on the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, larger and heavier, came out to fight. Octavian's Admiral Agrippa outmaneuvered them with lighter, quicker ships, and the battle tilted through the day. Then Cleopatra's squadron broke out and made for the open sea, running for Egypt, and Antony left his own fleet fighting and followed her sail south. What remained of their forces surrendered in the days after. The war was, in effect, decided. The following year, Octavian entered Alexandria, the city of the lighthouse and the library. Antony died first, by his own hand. Cleopatra, refusing to be led in chains through Rome, arranged her own death. By the bite of an ass, says the ancient tradition, though even the ancients were never quite sure of the means. With her ended the Ptolemies and the age of the pharaohs. And Egypt, this is the extraordinary part, became, in effect, the personal estate of the Roman emperor. The oldest kingdom on earth, folded into the newest empire. But conquest with Egypt was never a one-way door. Listen to the ways the Nile now flows quietly underneath everything Roman. First, bread. Rome was becoming a city of 1 million people, and a city that size cannot feed itself. At the empire's height, it swallowed perhaps 150 to 200,000 tons of imported grain a year, and roughly a third of it came from Egypt. The ancients said Africa could feed the city for 8 months of the year, and Egypt for 4. Each sailing season, grain fleets worked their way from Alexandria to Rome's harbours at Ostia and Portus. Thousands of merchant voyages a year, overseen by a great state machinery called the Annona. Think of what that means. As a night image, a city of 1 million people asleep, its bread somewhere out on the dark sea, its hunger rising and falling, year by year, with the same Nile flood we watched in the last video. Second, stone. In 10 BC, Augustus, as Octavian was by then called, we'll come properly to that name in a moment, shipped 2 obelisks from Egypt to Rome, needle-thin mountains of carved granite, as trophies of the conquest, dedicated to the sun. One, taken from Heliopolis, the sun city of our Egypt journey, was raised in the Campus Martius. The other went to the racetrack, the Circus Maximus. More would follow over the centuries until, and this is quite true, the city of Rome today has more ancient Egyptian obelisks standing in its squares than Egypt itself. The pharaoh's stones keeping watch over Roman piazzas to this day. And third, the gods. Egyptian religion sailed with the grain. The worship of Isis took root in Rome itself, with a great temple in the Campus Martius, and her rites there kept Egyptian hours. One initiate, the writer Apuleius, described being called to the goddess's nocturnal mysteries at that very temple. Lamps and vigils in the Roman dark for a goddess of the Nile. Rome had conquered Egypt, and Egypt, gently, endlessly, colonized Rome's imagination. One power now ruled the whole Mediterranean world, and one man ruled that power. The question no one could answer, the question that had killed Caesar, was what to call him. His answer was marble, and it is waiting in the next chapter. In 27 BC, Octavian stood before the Senate and, with perfect theatre, handed all his powers back. The Senate, knowing its part, begged him to keep them and gave him a new name, Augustus, the revered one. Notice what the name is not. It is not king. Rome would still not say that word. Augustus called himself simply Princeps, the first citizen. The consuls were still elected. The Senate still met. Every institution of the old republic remained carefully, lovingly in place, and power now flowed permanently and completely through one man. Rome had found its answer to the question that killed Caesar. An emperor is a king that a republic can pretend it doesn't have. On that quiet fiction, the empire would run for centuries and the city itself was made to say what no one dared say aloud. Augustus rebuilt Rome on a scale no one had attempted. Temples by the dozen, a new forum, theatres, porticos gleaming. Suetonius preserves the boast that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Even time was enlisted. That obelisk from Heliopolis was set up as the pointer of a colossal sundial laid out across the Campus Martius, a meadow of bronze lines and lettering, with Egyptian granite for its needle, stone already nearly 6 centuries old when Rome raised it. Nearby stood the altar of Augustan peace, carved with processions of the imperial family. It was long argued that the whole field was engineered so that on Augustus's own birthday, the obelisk's shadow would reach toward the altar of peace. Scholars have since questioned the neatness of that alignment, but stand with the image a moment regardless. Egyptian stone, telling Roman time, in a city rebuilt by one careful man. That was the empire, in a single shadow. Augustus's genius, though, was never really marble. It was administration, the unglamorous work of making a city of 1 million people survivable. And here is where our night thread picks him up. Rome, you'll remember, had no public fire service. Fire was a private catastrophe, and men like Crassus had grown rich on it. A magistrate named Ignatius Rufus had won dangerous popularity by running a fire brigade of his own enslaved workers, a lesson Augustus absorbed rather than repeated. And so, in the year 6 AD, he founded something genuinely new: the vigiles, the watchmen. 7 cohorts, initially perhaps 3,500 men, later doubled to around 7,000, recruited from freedmen, former slaves given a uniform and a public trust. Each cohort watched over 2 of the city's 14 districts. They patrolled from dusk through the whole of the dark, night watchmen and firefighters in one, carrying lanterns, buckets, axe and hooks for pulling down burning buildings. It was the first permanent public fire service in the Western world. And one more thread across the sea. Augustus is said to have modelled it partly on the fire brigade of Alexandria. Even Rome's knights had a little Egypt in them. Keep the vigils in mind. In the next chapter, we'll walk a full night at their side. Not everything bent to his careful order. In 9 AD, in the wet forests of Germany, 3 entire legions under the governor Varus were ambushed and destroyed at Teutoburg. The worst Roman defeat in generations, and one that fixed the empire's northern frontier at the Rhine, more or less forever. Suetonius tells us the Aeing Augustus took it like a wound that wouldn't close, that for months he would strike his head against a door, crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." It is the one image of him without the mask, the manager of the world, alone at night, arguing with a door. He died in 14 AD in his bed, an ending almost no Roman leader of the past century had managed. Suetonius says that at the end he asked his friends in effect whether he had played his part in the comedy of life well enough. And then, to his wife, "Live mindful of our wedlock, Livia, and farewell." He had held supreme power for over 40 years, and he handed to his successors a Mediterranean world at peace, the beginning of what history calls the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. 2 centuries in which the wars, mostly, stayed far away at the frontiers, and the great city could turn to the business of simply living, which means it is time. Let's leave the emperors for a while and go down into the streets after sundown. This is the chapter the whole video has been drifting toward. Forget the emperors entirely for a while. It is an ordinary evening in imperial Rome, sometime in the 1st or 2nd century AD, in a city of 1 million people, and you are standing in a narrow street, watching the light go. First, understand how Romans kept time, because their hours were not like ours. Every day, from sunrise to sunset, held exactly 12 hours, which meant the hours themselves stretched and shrank with the seasons. A midwinter daylight hour lasted about 45 of our minutes. A midsummer one, about 75. Time itself breathed with the year, and the night was divided not into hours, but into 4 watches, 3 of our hours each, more or less, counted off by water clocks, dripping steadily in the dark, because a sundial is no use to anyone at night. The first watch, as lamps are lit. The second and third, deep night. The fourth watch, the one that ends in birdsong. The Roman social day is winding down around you. The baths emptied in the late afternoon. Dinner, the cena, is finishing in 1,000 dining rooms as the light fails, because most Romans plan to be home before dark. The wealthy who do venture out travel in little islands of torchlight, slaves ahead of them carrying flames, because the unlit streets belong to whoever is in them. The poet Juvenal, Rome's great, grumbling satirist, and you should picture him grinning as he complains, catalogues the hazards of a night walk, chamber pots emptied from high windows, and the footpads waiting wherever the torchlight isn't. We can smile with him from a reflective distance. Satire exaggerates. That is its job. But no one satirizes an empty street, and then, as true darkness settles, Rome does something no other ancient city did on this scale. It gets louder. Remember Caesar's traffic law? Carts banned from the streets by day. Its consequence has arrived. Rumbling. Everything a city of 1,000,000 eats, wears, burns, and builds with is coming in tonight. Iron-shod wheels grinding over paving stones. Loaded wagons creaking under timber and wine and grain. Drovers cursing at oxen stalled in lanes never meant for 2 carts to pass. In Juvenal's Rome, and the law that caused it still survives, the delivery of an entire civilization happened after dark. Later emperors kept the system. When Rome raised its great marble monuments, even the building stone moved through the night. The sound of empire being built was a night sound. Juvenal, trying to sleep through it, left us the classic complaint. And here his own words, in an old translation, are worth hearing. Most sick people here in Rome, he writes, perish for want of sleep. And again, the crossing of wagons in the narrow, winding streets, the slanging of drovers when brought to a stand, would make sleep impossible for a Drusus or a sea calf. A sea calf is a seal, the sleepiest animal the Romans could think of. And Drusus, his commentators tell us, is probably a jab at the Emperor Claudius, famous for dozing off. Sleep, Juvenal grumbles, costs money in Rome. The rich man is carried above the crowds in a closed litter and naps as he goes. The poor man lies in his rented room while the wagons grind past below, and pays for his poverty in wakefulness. That rented room deserves a look, while its tenant lies there awake. Most Romans did not live in houses. They lived stacked. In the insulae, the apartment blocks, rising 4, 5, 6 stories over the shops at street level. And Roman logic ran opposite to ours. The higher you climbed, the cheaper the room, because every stair was a stair further from the water and from escape. Cheap timber and plaster construction made collapse an ordinary hazard, and fire a constant one. The poorest tenant of all lay directly under the roof tiles, up where the doves nested, the last to hear trouble on the stairs, the last to smell smoke rising from far below, because all through these buildings, on this ordinary night, there are open flames. That is what nighttime Rome is. Tens of thousands of small fires. Indoors. The braziers that heat the rooms. And everywhere, the little clay oil lamps, the lucernae, a wick in a spout, burning olive oil if the household can afford it, because olive oil burns cleaner and kinder than animal fat. Light this small is precious, and it organizes the home around itself. A lamp in a wall niche, a lamp on the table where someone is mending or reading or adding up accounts. The whole family gathered into one small warm circle, and darkness in every other corner. When archaeologists dug Pompeii, they found more lamps and lighting gear there than in any other ancient city. A civilization of little flames, which is why, out in the dark streets, the vigils are walking, 7 cohorts spread across the 14 districts, following their lantern light through the alleys, hour after hour, with their buckets and axes and hooks, listening, smelling the air, watching the high windows for a glow that is bigger than a lamp. They are firefighters first, but night police too, pausing to question the man walking too quickly, collaring thieves, keeping a rough kind of order. 1 million people sleep more easily when they can sleep at all, because these freedmen are awake in a city that feared fire above almost everything. The vigils were the night itself, keeping watch, and on certain special nights of the year, the darkness itself turned holy. In early December, in the house of a chief magistrate, the rites of Bona Dea, the good goddess, were held at night by women only, the Vestal virgins themselves among them, every male sent out of the house, so strictly that when one young aristocrat smuggled himself in 62 BC, the scandal shook Roman politics for years. No male author ever saw those rites. So about what actually happened on those nights, our sources are, fittingly, in the dark. A fortnight later came Saturnalia, the midwinter festival, when the social order was gently turned upside down, and the longest nights of the year were answered with light, lamps burning late, and wax candles, a traditional Saturnalia gift, glowing in windows against the dark of the dying year. And in the Campus Martius, at the temple of the goddess from the Nile, the lamps of Isis burned through her night vigils, Egypt keeping its own hours. In the middle of Rome, deep in the 4th watch, the wagons thin out, the water clock drips, the vigil's lanterns swing homeward through the grey. Somewhere high in an insula, a lamp that has burned all night, gutters and goes out, unneeded. The sky above the 7 hills is turning pale. Rome, which never quite slept, begins, at least, to wake. Back, now, to the palace, where Augustus's careful machine was passing into less careful hands. We'll take the famous names gently. This is not a channel for palace horror stories, and the horror stories, as we'll see, are not always true anyway. Tiberius, the capable, joyless heir, who governed well and was loved by no one, and withdrew in the end to an island. Caligula, the young favourite who curdled within a year or two into something erratic and frightening, and was killed by his own guards. And here, pause for the famous story that Caligula made his horse, Incitatus, a consul of Rome. It didn't happen. Suetonius says only that people said he intended it. Another historian says he promised it. Some modern scholars suspect the whole tale grew from one of Caligula's own barbed jokes, that his horse could do the Senate's job. History, gently warped in the retelling, a theme of this chapter. And then Claudius, the limping, stammering scholar the palace had always mocked, hauled from behind a curtain and made emperor by the guards, who surprised everyone by ruling well. Britain conquered, a great harbour begun at Ostia. He is also, you'll remember, the Emperor Rome's satirists teased for falling asleep, our patron saint, perhaps, for tonight, and then Nero. And with Nero, fire on the night of the 18th of July, 64 AD, flame broke out among the shops around the Circus Maximus and took hold. It burned for 9 days. When it finally died, 10 of the city's 14 districts were damaged or destroyed. The worst fire Rome ever suffered, in a city we now know was made of little flames waiting for their chance. You have heard, of course, that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. He didn't. And not only because the fiddle wouldn't be invented for more than 1,000 years. Tacitus, our best source, a careful historian who was actually alive in those years, records that Nero was away at Actium when the fire began, that he hurried back, opened the public buildings and his own gardens to the homeless, and brought in grain. The story that he sang of the fall of Troy while the city burned, Tacitus reports strictly as a rumor that went around, and later writers embellished the scene until the rumor hardened into the legend everyone knows. What is true and darker is what came after. Casting about for someone to blame, Nero fixed on a small, unpopular sect called the Christians and made public spectacle of their deaths. Cruelties so extreme, Tacitus says, that even a hostile crowd began to pity them. We'll leave it at that one sentence. History doesn't need decoration to be heavy. Nero fell 4 years later. And in the year 69, the year of the 4 emperors, civil war handed the throne to a blunt, capable soldier named Vespasian. Tacitus says that year revealed the empire's dangerous secret, that emperors could be made elsewhere than in Rome by armies. File that thought. It returns in the late chapters. Vespasian's dynasty gave Rome its most famous building, a colossal amphitheater raised pointedly on the drained ornamental lake of Nero's private palace, the pleasure grounds of one man, remade into an arena for everyone. The building we call the Colosseum opened under his son Titus in 80 AD. What happened on its sand? This channel will keep at a reflective distance, but as architecture and as politics in stone, it has never been surpassed. Under Titus came disaster of a different kind, and with it, the most haunting night writing in Roman literature. On the traditional date of the 24th of August, 79 AD, though some archaeologists argue from the finds for a date in autumn, Vesuvius erupted and buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. Across the bay at Misenum, a young man named Pliny watched it happen and later wrote down what he had seen in 2 letters to the historian Tacitus, the only eyewitness account that survives. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, commander of the fleet, sailed toward the mountain to rescue whom he could, and died in the attempt. The younger Pliny describes the darkness that fell as the ash came down. In his words, not that of a moonless or cloudy night, but the blackness of pent-up places which never see the light. Around him in that blackness, people cried out, and here is his line, gently, that this night would last forever, and the end of all the world had come. It hadn't, but under that ash, an ordinary Roman day was kept, every lamp and loaf of it, waiting 17 centuries to teach us nearly everything we know about how Romans actually lived, including, you'll remember, all those lamps. The frontiers too had their nights. In Britain, Boudicca rose in 60 AD and burned 3 Roman towns before the revolt was crushed. Tacitus, again, is our witness. In the 2nd century came the run of steady hands historians call the 5 good emperors. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest extent. His conquest of Dacia in 106 AD pushed the frontier beyond the Danube, and his successor Hadrian chose deliberately to stop, to consolidate and draw the edges of empire in stone. In Britain, beginning in 122 AD, that meant a wall, 73 miles of it, coast to coast, with small garrisons spaced along it mile by mile. Spare a thought for those sentries. Men recruited from sunnier provinces, standing their watches on a parapet in the long northern dark, sleet in the wind, 1 mile castle's lamp visible from the next. The empire, at its very edge, was a chain of small lights in the night, and at the empire's height stands a figure this channel was almost designed for. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the last of those steady hands. He spent his final years not in Rome but in army camps on the Danube frontier, holding back wars he took no joy in, and at night, in his tent, by lamplight, he wrote, not decrees, notes to himself, reminders to be patient, to be just, to accept what comes. Private philosophy never meant for another reader. The book survived him. We call it the Meditations. An empire at its pinnacle, and its most lasting artifact is one tired man's midnight notebook. He died in 180 AD, and historians, looking back, would mark that year as the place where the long afternoon of Rome begins to slant toward evening. Nothing announced it. That is the first thing worth understanding about the 3 centuries we are about to walk through. There was no morning on which the empire woke up and was told what was happening to it. The roads still ran. The grain fleets still sailed. The vigiles still walked their 14 districts with their lanterns and their buckets, listening for fire in the dark, exactly as they had under Augustus. It is only from where we are sitting, very far away and very late, that we can see the light beginning to change. It begins with a small hinge. Those steady hands of the 2nd century had each chosen a successor on merit and adopted him. Marcus Aurelius had a son of his own, Commodus, and so the succession quietly reverted to the oldest and least reliable rule there is, the accident of birth. What followed Commodus was civil war, and out of that war rose a new dynasty, the Severans, and in the year 235, the last of them, Alexander Severus, was murdered, and the lid came off the Roman world. Historians call what follows the crisis of the 3rd century. From 235 to 284, 49 years, more than 20 men were raised to the purple. Most of them died violently. You may remember the thought I asked you to file away back in the year of the 4 emperors. Tacitus's dangerous secret that an emperor could be made somewhere other than Rome by an army. Here it is, arriving. For half a century, the Roman world belonged to whichever man the nearest legions happened to be shouting for that season, proclaimed in a camp, on a frontier, in the mud, 1,000 miles from the Senate that was supposed to be confirming him. The thing Rome had feared since Sulla marched on the city, and then learned to live with. and then forgotten to be frightened of, came due all at once, with interest, and it came with everything else. Plague moved through the provinces. Prices climbed, and the coinage meant less each year than it had meant the year before. In the east, a new Persian power, the Sassanids, pressed against the frontier. In the north, Germanic peoples pressed against the other one, and under that pressure from both ends, the empire did something it had never done in its history. It came apart in the middle. A separate Gallic empire broke away in the west. In the east, the caravan city of Palmyra took charge of the Roman provinces around it and ruled them itself. For a few years there were 3 Romes, and then one man put them back together. Aurelian ruled for 5 years, from 270 to 275, and in those 5 years he recovered the west and recovered the east and made the empire one thing again. They gave him a title I find genuinely moving, considering the century that produced it: Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. But it is what he did at home that belongs to this video. For 500 years, the city of Rome had needed no walls. That was the quiet boast underneath everything. Underneath the marble, underneath the Pax Romana, underneath the sentries freezing on Hadrian's parapet in the far northern dark. The frontier was so distant and so certain that the capital of the world simply did not require defending. Rome's walls were other people's countries. Aurelian looked at the century he was living in and had a wall built around Rome. Picture that work going on, because it is the image at the heart of this chapter. A wall long enough to ring a city of 1 million people, raised through the seasons and war. Because work on that scale does not stop at sundown, raised by torchlight, scaffolds against the dark, baskets going up hand over hand, a line of small fires creeping around the edge of the city, night after night, tracing out the shape of the new limit. And every Roman who stood at an upstairs window and watched those torches move understood something that no edict had to tell them. The world had come closer. The city that had walled other people's countries was now walling itself. Order, when it properly returned, came from a soldier's son named Diocletian, who took the throne in 284 and spent 20 years rebuilding the machine from the frame up. He decided that one man could not hold the empire, so he split it on purpose before anyone else could split it for him. 2 senior emperors, 2 junior ones, 4 courts, 4 armies. The Tetrarchy. He pulled mobile field armies back behind layered frontiers, so that a breach was no longer a catastrophe. He tried to command the prices in the markets by edict, with the success you would expect. And he ruled from the east, because that was where the wealth was and where the danger was. The consequence of that last decision is quiet and enormous. Rome was still the name of everything. It was no longer the place from which everything was run. He also did the rarest thing an emperor of Rome could do. In 305, he retired, alive, on purpose, and into a great palace by the sea on the Dalmatian coast, at the place we now call Split. A later writer tells the story that when they came begging him to take the world in hand again, he told them to come and look at the cabbages he had grown with his own hands, and then talk to him about power. That is an anecdote rather than a transcript. It comes to us long after the fact, but it is a lovely one to be handed. The next great name arrives out of a night on the 28th of October, 312. Constantine marched on Rome to fight a rival at the Milvian Bridge. And here is the story his chroniclers told. One of them, Lactantius, says that in the night before the battle, Constantine was told in a dream to mark his soldiers' shields with a sign. Another, Eusebius, writing later, describes a cross of light in the sky and words with it. In this sign, conquer. The two accounts are both Christian, and they do not agree with each other, and they are the accounts we have. So we hold them the way we have held every founding story tonight, gently, at arm's length. What is not in doubt is the mark that went onto the shields, and that Constantine won the bridge within a year at Milan. The faith that Nero had once made a public spectacle of was a faith the Emperor of Rome protected, and in 330, Constantine dedicated a new capital, not in Italy, but on a Greek town called Byzantium, on the straits where Europe looks across at Asia. He tripled its size. He drew the ranking families east with grants of citizenship and a bread dole, the way you might tempt a household to move by promising a better kitchen. And the city took his name, Constantinople. From that year on, there were two centers of gravity in the Roman world, and the heavier one was no longer beside the Tiber. Then, in 378, near a city called Adrianople, Gothic cavalry destroyed the Eastern Field Army and killed the Emperor Valens somewhere in the wreck of it. But the battle is not really the point. The settlement afterwards is. From then on, Gothic peoples lived inside the frontier as armed nations rather than as subjects, allies on paper, and something less easily described in practice. The border had stopped being a line and started being a suggestion, and in 395, the Emperor Theodosius died and left the empire to his two sons, one the east won the West. It had been divided before, for convenience, and always put back together. This time, it was not put back together. 2 courts, 2 treasuries, 2 armies, and only one of them was going to see the next century out. The lamps of the West are still burning as this chapter closes. There are simply fewer hands now to fill them. Now, at last, we come back to the Geese, very nearly 800 years earlier. On the Romans' own reckoning, a flock of sacred birds woke a starving garrison on the Palatine in the dark, and a soldier reached the cliff top first, and the citadel held. And from that night to this one, no foreign enemy had been inside the city of Rome. The night it ended was the 24th of August, 410 AD. Alaric's Visigoths had come to the city twice before, and twice gone away again. This time they stayed and let hunger do the work for them. Inside walls that had stood for the better part of a century and a half, and had never once had to save the city. And then, in the dark, someone opened the Solarian gate. Who and why, the ancient accounts cannot agree on. Treachery, say some. Others, that the hunger inside had simply become worse than the army outside. One tradition holds that it was slaves who had, when you think about it, every reason. And I rather love that we do not know, because whichever it was, the thing itself was small and human and took a moment. A bar lifted, a gate swinging in the middle of the night, 8 centuries ending without a sound. The Visigoths were in the city for 3 days, and here the truth is gentler than the legend, which does not happen often. So let us take it while it is offered. By the standards of what a sack could be, Alaric's was restrained. The great churches, St. Peter's among them, were declared places of sanctuary and were honored as such. Things burned, people suffered, but Rome was not erased the way Rome had once erased Carthage, and everyone involved knew the difference. The wound was symbolic, and the symbol traveled faster and further than any account of the actual damage. Far away in Bethlehem, an old scholar named Jerome wrote, in effect, that the city which had taken the whole world had itself been taken. Those are not his exact words, but that is exactly what the Roman world felt that autumn. After 410, the West came apart in the least dramatic way imaginable. Not so much conquered as let go, province by province, by a government with fewer soldiers each year and less money to pay them with. Britain slipped loose around 410, and the legions did not come back. In the 420s and 30s, the Vandals crossed into Africa, and by 439 they held Carthage. Stop on that one a moment, because it matters far more than it sounds. Carthage was the grain, the African harvest that had kept a city of 1 million people fed. Those fleets we watched crossing the dark sea, all those chapters ago, the bread of a sleeping city somewhere out on the water, now belonged to somebody else. An empire can survive losing a battle. It struggles to survive losing its breakfast. Attila's Huns came, and in 452 were turned back. In 455, the Vandals sailed up from Africa and sacked Rome themselves. A fortnight this time, and far more thorough than Alaric had been. And then comes the ending everybody has heard of, which is not quite an ending. On the 4th of September, 476, a general named Odoacer deposed the boy who was sitting on the western throne and sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople. Textbooks have been ending their chapters on that sentence for a very long time, so it is worth saying plainly, in the dark, that the people alive at the time did not. 9 Western emperors had risen and fallen in the 21 years since the Vandals came. One more going was hardly news. The boy had never been recognized in the East at all. He was a usurper's son, and the Western emperor the Eastern court did recognize, Julius Nepos, was not in Rome and was not deposed, and went on living, and went on being styled Emperor of the West until 480. Nothing changed in the city on the 5th of September. The bakers baked. The carts came in after dark, the way they always had. The fall of Rome in 476 is a date chosen long afterwards by historians, because a story needs a last page, and that one was conveniently tidy. Take it as a symbol. It is a good symbol. It is not a moment, but history does allow itself one piece of poetry here, and I would not dream of depriving you of it at this hour. The boy Odoacer deposed was named Romulus, and because he was young and slight, and never truly an emperor at all, they had given him a diminutive of the imperial name, Augustulus, the little Augustus. The last emperor in the West carried the name of Rome's first king and the name of Rome's first emperor in miniature. 12 centuries folded down into one child's name. Nobody arranged that. History simply does it sometimes, when no one is watching. And in the East, of course, nothing ended at all. From Constantinople, the empire carried on, its people calling it the Roman Empire, and calling themselves Romans, in an unbroken line, for very nearly another 1,000 years, until 1453. The lamps did not go out in the West, not on any particular night, and not all at once. They were simply filled less often, and tended by fewer people, until one day the room they lit was a different room, with a different name. We began tonight with a single oil lamp, on the flat, dark crown of a hill above a river. Clay, no larger than your hand. A spout, a wick, a spoonful of olive oil, and a flame about the size of a leaf. 12 centuries later, that lamp has not been blown out. It has burned lower. That is all. There is less oil in it and fewer hands to fill it, and the room around it has changed owners more than once, but the light itself is still doing what light does. It has only moved somewhere else. It moved into law, into the idea that a rule ought to be written down in public, where anybody at all can walk up and read it. Rome did that on 12 tables in a muddy forum 2,500 years ago, and we have never quite let go of it since. It moved into the roads, which stayed where the legions laid them, and into the towns that kept growing, where the camps had been. It is in the calendar on your wall, still keeping Caesar's time, and it is in these very letters, the alphabet you have read every day of your life and never once thanked anybody for. This is why much modern scholarship has grown shy of the word fall and is likelier to call these centuries late antiquity, and to describe not a collapse, but a long transformation, an empire dissolving slowly, patiently, into everything that came after it. Not a crash, a lamp burning lower, and the light becoming something else. Or so, did Rome fall? Some nights I think the honest answer is that it never quite finished. It stopped being a place and became a habit of mind, an argument about laws and roads, and whether one man should ever be allowed to hold all the light at once. That is where we will stop tonight. Not on a date, on a light-changing colour. Thank you for drifting with us. From a shepherd's fire on a muddy hilltop, through a kingdom and a republic and an empire, to a gate opening quietly in the dark. If you would like more nights like this one, the subscribe button is somewhere below, and it will still be there in the morning. There is no hurry. There never is here, and if you are somehow still awake, look at the lamp one last time, somewhere above a river, on the flat, dark crown of a hill. A small clay lamp burns down to the last of its oil. The flame stands very still. It leans. It flickers. And the room fills, very gently, with the grey of a morning that is not Roman anymore, and somehow never stopped being Roman either. Sleep well.